So I proposed this presentation right after getting back from Luna in May, when I'd found out from a presentation that Alan Jones did that ILLiad finally had a write API where you could place requests through their API rather than having to do it in the interface. So I was really excited, and I wrote a presentation proposal saying that I was going to write this like one-click integration. It turned out to be a little bit more complicated than I thought, so that's still a work in progress, but I'm still going to talk about what I looked at, what I've done so far, and what our plans are for going forward. So why one click? We've gotten regular feedback from patrons who feel that they have to log into our website and our other services too often. We do have single sign-on on campus, but neither Primo nor ILLiad use CAS or Shibboleth. And so bringing in the request through the API in some ways would be easier than integrating ILLiad with Shibboleth. We might have more control over the metadata. So instead of sending patrons to a form where they can delete or add information that may or may not be helpful, we can just take the information from the PNX and send it straight into ILLiad, which hopefully will reduce staff time and potentially let us take advantage of consortial borrowing agreements and things like Rapid ILL more easily. Then ILLiad does have write APIs. They've apparently had them since December last year, but I didn't find out about them until May. And it's really exciting. They're pretty well documented, and there's links there to them. And then we moved to the Primo new UI in June. We didn't want to do new development against our classic UI because we knew we'd be moving soon. And then I'd written a small component in Primo, and I was like, wow, this is really easy. I can do this way, way more complicated thing. So my plan was to add a button in the brief results and in the get it to section of the detailed results whenever there's no online access and no print access at our library. Clicking the button would submit the request, and then a message would be returned to the patron saying, thanks, you've submitted this request. This is your tracking number. You can click on it to see where it is in the queue. Or if the request failed, they'd be sent out to ILLiad to do something there, maybe add information if they needed to, or get in touch with the staff person to troubleshoot. So this is kind of what it would look like. This is a screenshot of our Primo. There's online access for some things, and then a little request button for something that we don't actually have. So my plan was to write a new component for Primo that would send out the request and display this nice message at the end. To use a tool called NiFi to do the back-end processing of the API to do better security with the API key and handle responses and possible errors. It's something that we're already using, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But it's a really easy drag-and-drop sort of programming tool. And then I was going to release it. But what happened is that NiFi was great. I did all the configuration there for sending the API to ILLiad and getting the response back. I used Postman to test that before I worked in NiFi, and that worked really well, too. But I forgot about authentication. So I'd forgotten that ILLiad needs an ID from the patron, so we know who they are. And we don't get the username that we use in ILLiad in Primo. So the next step is to write a lookup using the Aleph ID that we have in Primo against, I think in Aleph we have the net ID, but I don't know for sure. We may have to look somewhere else, like in our campus systems, for the net ID, and then get that back and then send that on to ILLiad. And then I think I ran into a bug with a Primo get-it link to PRM after tag. So I want to either check with somebody from Ex Libris. That sounds like they're not here at this point, or maybe one of you has run into this with something else. And if I can't figure it out today, I'll submit a Salesforce case. And then the component was a lot more complicated. Writing a component to just display a link is not too bad. But writing something that sends a request without opening a new window and returns a message and displays it back again was a little bit more complicated. So this is my new, more focused and detailed plan, probably more realistic. And I've gone through some of this other pieces. We need a more secure way to store the API key. We don't want to do it in NiFi itself. So I'll probably use parameter store, which is something we're already using on campus. I want to add error reporting or at least tracking. So if there are errors that are coming through, rather than relying exclusively on patrons to report them, we want to find out and have a log of them so that we can go back and find out more about them. And we'll probably use Sentry, which is something else that our developers are using for logging and monitoring. And then finally, we'll test and double check accessibility, and then hopefully release. The last step is something that we've started talking about too, is expanding API calls. So it's not just sending things to ILLiad, but we're in a couple of borrowing consortiums that we can place direct requests for things. And so we may want to query those before we send the request on to Olive, because we can get to ILLiad, because we can get things a lot faster from some of these other systems than we can through just regular ILL service, which still has a lot of manual processing, and it doesn't have like real-time availability lookup. So we send it on to one university, they don't have it, we send it on to another one. And we may look at features from the IDS logic rule kit as well for that. So a quick diversion, because I don't have like something working to show you, I want to talk a little bit more about NiFi. It's a flow processing tool distributed by Apache. It was developed, I think, by the NSA a while ago in the United States. It's really good at processing data. So you take an input, you do stuff with it, and then you output. It doesn't have to be the same input and output format. It can be totally different. There's 260 or so processors available out of the box. So I used a number of HTTP processing ones. And I'll show you what it sort of looks like on the next slide. It's literally like drag and drop, and there's menu options, and you can pull things. So for those of us who aren't developers full time, this is a really, really like low bar to entry for doing things that you sort of know what you want to do logically, but doing the programming behind it can be trickier. You don't need to know with NiFi as much syntax. You still need to know what you want to do and figure out how to do it, but it does reduce some of the burden. And it's got built-in messaging and queuing, so when things go wrong, you can send them to different places and then go back and troubleshoot what happened there, and it has really good error messages for you. We're using it for a number of things at Notre Dame already, and plan to use it for a few more things. And so this is what the processing for the ILLiad API looks like. It comes in, like a request comes in here. And then for right now, I was just adding the API key here. And then I think changing the content just a little bit. And then sending it to ILLiad. And then if it's successful, it comes here. And then we come and display message to the user. And if it's not successful, it comes up here. And this is a branch for some error logging. And then it also displays a message to the patron saying, I'm sorry, this was unsuccessful. Here's some options for you instead. And that's what I have. Thank you. There's also some of the things that I mentioned at the very end, a sort of summary list of those. Are there questions or ideas, things you have thought about that are similar?
It's not a technical question, more an organizational question. Placing request links more prominently on the user interface. Did you encounter, say, negative remarks from library staff handling these requests regarding, oh my God, we're going to be swamped with requests, stuff like that? And if yes, how did you solve it, or just you just go through with it?
So that's a really good question. And I have been working with our ILL borrowing manager as we work through these questions. From her perspective, as long as the requests can be placed automatically through something like Rapid ILL, which just looks at an ISBN or an ISSN in a year, and then sends the request on, so her staff don't have to do anything manual with it, she's fine with the request getting increased. We have had staff cuts, not staff cuts in ILL so much as that we've had retirements and the positions haven't been replaced. So it is definitely a concern, and I think Alan said when they made ILL requests easier, they saw like 100% increase in requests. So there's clearly a barrier to our patrons, and then I think it's on us to figure out how to make it easy for them and then make it easy for our staff too, so that their workload doesn't go way out the roof.
Okay.
Just a quick statement. Is there a lifetime? I know I did the same thing to everybody else.
Is there a lifetime to ILLiad? This is super valuable, obviously, but
Yeah,
will it
sure.
work with the successor to ILLiad?
That's a really good question, and I don't have the answer. We're not planning to move to Tapasa or something else for at least 2 to 3 years. So from our perspective, it was still worthwhile to do something in the meantime, and we're hoping that Tapasa, say, would have APIs. I was on a little group talking to the Tapasa developers about APIs, and basically the APIs that they released for ILLiad this fall were almost exactly what we'd been asking OCLC to develop for Tapasa. So I'm hopeful that that means that it's in the works there too.
So I actually was just at the resource sharing meeting for Tapasa, and they hadn't slated API development within the Tapasa framework until 2020. And so part of the reason that we actually started in late 2020, no less. So I guess that's the shelf date of ILLiad, or something along those lines.
Well, yeah, and they've said that they're not going to force anybody to move.
We've heard that before, but
Right.
that's, the point being that there's a really stable, well-documented structure for the API framework for ILLiad right now that people can take advantage of. And you can basically deal with this with an HTTP service request. It's not hard at all.
Yeah, the ILLiad part of it was like super fast. It was like a couple of hours, and like I'm a librarian, not a developer. This is not what I do full time, but it was.
But the other thing that
straightforward.
this also highlights, and this is part of your problem, and I ran into the same thing doing my thing, is the fact that because Ex Libris is not exposing all IDs, whether it's the patron barcode, whether it's the user ID, but they're basically giving a single user ID, you may or may not be using that as your user key for that particular user. And so you have to do some type of external lookup somewhere, even though all of those IDs reside in Aleph.
Right.
Which is the even more frustrating thing about it, or Alma for that matter. So this is an area that I hope, well, nobody hears from Ex Libris, so that's kind of unfortunate. But this is yet another reason why all of those user IDs have to be exposed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? A general question, or do we have somebody who's...
So I've been working on a similar integration with Alma and ILLiad.
Okay.
We actually enabled SHIB authentication through EasyProxy.
Yeah, we looked at that.
Just because it was the easiest way to get it
Yeah.
up and running. But the ILLiad and Alma integration has been part of the reason it's kind of hit a roadblock is because our university is very security focused. And so now the next step is to have it go through testing. But yeah, one of the biggest troubles I ran into is getting that ID out of Alma because the login name is not the ID that they use in ILLiad.
Right.
And the thing I don't like about the APIs that they do have is there's no user write APIs.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, how do you handle users that don't currently have an account with, or
So
like, were you planning on it?
That was the next phase, like once I got sort of the initial piece working. My plan was to basically, if ILLiad returned that like we don't have a user for this, so we have our permissions in ILLiad set so that you don't have to be approved by staff members once you register. So what I was hoping I could do was put in a user temporarily and put the request in and send them something that would say like, please finish your registration now. If that didn't work, it would basically do like, it would send an error back and it would say, please go to ILLiad to place this request for the first time, and then subsequently you'll be able to do it here without logging in again. That was sort of my direction.
Gotcha. Yeah, the way we are going to be tackling it is just direct manipulation of the ILLiad database that we're hosting.
Do you have a hosted server or a local server?
Local.
Okay, yeah, we're hosted. So I don't
My
think we have that
previous
kind of.
university was hosted, so we weren't able to take this route
Right.
before. So
We've wanted to do more with like user database manipulation, like expiring patrons and things, but haven't been able to do that either.
Is there actually anybody in Europe using ILLiad? Cool. Other question, is there anybody who already did some flow-based programming using NiFi or some other tool like Node-RED or whatever? Oh, okay, interesting. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.